you look around Boston today, what do you see? You might not notice this in your everyday lives, but Boston was one of the most racially segregated cities in America.
I think Boston is like the #2 most unequal city now, depending on which survey you look at.
In fact, Boston is in the top 20% of highly segregated cities, according to census data, up there with Birmingham, Alabama.
But why does this racial segregation exist? Along with gender, sexual orientation, disability, and religion, neither race nor ethnicity should be a determining factor in where a person is permitted to live. Yet, the practice of denying people of color the financial support or resources necessary for them to live in certain neighborhoods without so much as considering their qualifications was once the most pressing issue in Boston, and maybe even in the whole country. This was redlining.
In the 1960s and 70s, racial minority groups such as African Americans and Latinos have had difficulty obtaining the same houses in the same neighborhoods as white people. According to the Federal Housing Administration, they were shown fewer homes and told about fewer listings, and were asked more questions about their qualifications, were steered to other communities, and even noted higher loan rates and fewer discounts when they did manage to close on a house.
There are certain neighborhoods that have no mortgages to blacks, Latinos, small number to Asians. So you can start to see the patterns getting more rigid in terms of the racial wealth divide. So we know, for instance, that the median wealth, according to the Federal Reserve, is like $8 for African American households, and it's over $100,000 for white households in the city. So that in itself tells us a picture.
Colored people were typically guided to specific areas of Boston, such as Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, which comprise of lower income minority groups today.
Banks literally drew lines around certain neighborhoods and would only provide mortgages in certain places and not in others.
There was one story in particular that jumps out in my mind. I had an apartment for rent, and for whatever reason, apartments were more of where I saw some discrimination. I've never really seen it in sales. I was showing the apartments, so I went to the property, met with a homeowner. We were waiting by the door for the tenants to come, and a car pulls up and two girls come out. They happen to be African American, and the homeowner kind of put her hand to her mouth and said, "Oh no, you're gonna show my apartment to these kind of people?" And I kind of turned to her and said, "What did you just say?" And she's like, "Well, what I meant was," I said, "I know what you meant. Here are your keys. I'm not working for you anymore." So that was my one and only experience with anything that had to do with race.
According to the MAPC's regional prosperity indicators, African Americans and Latinos need to make almost 5 times the income of white households to live in the same neighborhood. And on top of that, 45% of all mortgages to black homeowners in Massachusetts are concentrated on 5 cities. Less than 5% is in Boston.
If you look around Metro Boston, there are whole neighborhoods that were built with low interest loans that went almost entirely to white homeowners that helped them get on the wealth building train.
I always say, "Why are you still here? It's so segregated."
Naira Hall has lived in Roxbury since age 7 and owns several homes here.
And I started seeing how expensive it was.
Because of redlining, Boston neighborhoods such as West Roxbury, East Boston, and the Seaport District are the more wealthier parts of Boston compared to areas like Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury.
I think the racial wealth divide is a multi-generational fat force. So if your parents owned a home, then the likelihood that you'll be buying a home is greater. And if your grandparents owned a home, they got on the wealth building train and they were able to kind of have the economic capacity. So we're looking at a multi-generational, so even if there isn't overt redlining, 2 generations later, the impact of redlining in Boston still affects the composition of our neighborhoods.
This inequality is the effect of redlining through multiple generations, as well as the renovation of previously affordable houses, otherwise known as gentrification, which further serves to deprive lower income earners of adequate housing by displacing them and affects the overall racial population of the area.
We want to be able to live in a range of locations and not be corralled into the areas where there's been a lot of neglect.
These unjust methods of separating minority groups by making normally affordable houses financially unattainable have bled into the Boston we live in today and has essentially formed the borders between what are believed to be good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods.
Boston is a city that loves its history, a history of privileging those who have been empowered in the past and not privileging those who want to get power now.
The mass banking study shows even if there's not redlining, there are not enough mortgages being issued now to people of color in particularly in certain neighborhoods. But that may be primarily economic. Who's buying $3 million condos? It may not be overt discrimination. It may be just economic inequality is making it hard for certain people to buy.
What also contributed to the patterns of racial and economic segregation in Boston today was the White Flight, a period of time where white residents of Boston migrated to suburban areas. This was caused primarily by busing. In 1974, as an effort to integrate schools in Boston after a federal court deemed that BPS was intentionally segregating students, children of color were shipped across the city to predominantly white areas. This did not fare well for the white people in these communities, many of whom protested, boycotted, or even left their own neighborhoods.
The city of Boston, in their attempts to desegregate a lot of the schools and kind of mix up the kids from the more affluent areas in Boston to the poorer neighborhoods, passed a law that said, okay, we're going to bus all the kids to, no matter where they live, to another school and kind of mix everybody up. And so if you lived walking distance to your school, it didn't matter, you would get bused across town and go to a different school. So what that did was a lot of the parents got up in arms saying, geez, we live so close to our school, why are we busing my kid across town? And a lot of them got up and said, you know what, we're leaving.
I wouldn't care if they were green or purple. It's the idea of putting my kid on a bus when I have a school right across the street from where they should go. I don't care what color they are.
Property values fell. A lot of people couldn't sell. They had just abandoned their homes, or they just rented them to whoever they could and got out. At the same time, rent control was instituted. So now you had busing and rent control. Rent control, the dynamic with rent control is that if a landlord cannot get market rents for their property, now all of a sudden they're forced to, obviously not thinking of who they're going to rent to, but it was, okay, I can only charge for this much for rent, so if something needed to be fixed, I don't really have the money to fix it because I'm not getting much rent, and even if I fix it, I'm not going to be able to get more rent, so they just let their properties kind of get run down. So the properties being run down, a lot of the homeowners moving out of the city, the real estate market in the city of Boston really took a nosedive, especially in areas where there were a lot of multifamilies. Such as Jamaica Plain, South End, Roslindale, Roxbury, Dorchester, South Boston. So all these areas kind of started declining, both because people moved out, nobody really wanted to move in, and property values fell. So that void, that vacancy was kind of filled with people in a lower income bracket that said, hey, this is great, we'll move here, we don't mind living here at such cheap rates. A lot of them purchased property, a lot of them rented here.
There's an interesting global dynamic, which is in the 50s and 60s, the rich left cities and they went to suburbs and they went to the ring neighborhoods. Now, the global trend is the rich are moving back into center cities. So if you've ever been to like New York City, Manhattan now, parts of Manhattan are like a theme park for the wealthy. Paris, the center of Paris is affluent, and low and middle income people live in the periphery. And that is the trend now that's starting to happen in Boston. So the downtown now is becoming desirable. Back Bay has always been one of the most affluent neighborhoods, Beacon Hill, Those are the most affluent neighborhoods in the city historically. But now we're starting to see wealthy people, in the near Boston Latin School. If you walk down Boylston Street near Fenway Park, that neighborhood has changed in 10 years. It used to be a kind of a low-income renters neighborhood, and now it's a lot of new luxury housing is being built there.
On top of redlining, busing shaped the racial and economic demographics of the Boston we know today.
But how do we rectify generations worth of institutional racism? One that started long before redlining and has its roots in the colonization and enslavement of people of color.
10 years from now, we're going to wake up and there's going to be 6,000 more luxury units. And when I say luxury, I'm talking about $3 million condos and up.
In truth, the possibility of rectifying inequality in Boston as the next few decades is a long shot, but it's not impossible. In order to achieve such an ambitious goal, every person in the United States, the federal and state government has to support the movement. It can't be just Boston, a single city and a single state. Here's what Chuck Collins has to say about it.
So right now, 20% of the housing in Boston is permanently affordable, meaning that 20% of that housing isn't going to get gentrified, people aren't going to be displaced from it. I think the goal should be to increase that percentage. We proposed a luxury real estate tax, so taxing real estate transfers at a very high level, let's say $3 million and up, and put that into a fund that goes toward expanding that permanently affordable housing pool.
On top of enforcing luxury real estate taxes, which will help diversify communities, another way to reverse the consequences of redlining is to actually go to the heart of the matter, discrimination.
The city will begin an outreach program to investigate the claims of people who believe they were discriminated against.
After looking into the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, which works to eradicate and prevent discrimination in housing, education, and employment, we noted an audit that reported shortcomings in the agency's investigations of complaints since 2012. By actually completing these investigations within a regulatory timeframe and meeting the quota of cases per month, the MCAD could actually end implicit and explicit biases in the public fields, which will further our mission to bring equitable access to all housing opportunities in Boston, regardless of race or ethnicity.
Another area that could use improvements is the distribution of non-FHA loans to Black and Latino households in Boston. This cannot just be credited to the disproportionate amount of colored lower income earners. This concentration of government-issued loans in one community is not healthy. Having a variety of loans is necessary for getting low interest rates and maximizing your credit score, which leads to a likelihood of getting non-government loan approvals. This can lead to finding better housing in different neighborhoods and will diversify the demographic makeup of Boston communities as we know it. Our final suggestion that will help decrease the stark income gaps between different neighborhoods in Boston is to raise taxes on the top 1%, who average more than $2 million per household. Although this is unlikely to happen since it must pass through Congress, we can still hope that one day the burden of paying taxes will no longer fall on the working class. If the rich are no longer the ones getting richer, economic inequality could be eradicated once and for all, which will have a direct effect on the racial distribution of neighborhoods in Boston. This problem of racial segregation in Boston does not only affect housing, it has everything to do with wealth, education, employment, transportation, and so much more. Why do people of color have to struggle to get loans? Why are white people more likely to get houses in well-off neighborhoods? And why are taxes placed on the shoulders of the middle class instead of the richest people in America? Hopefully, by addressing these 4 points, we will be able to break the cycle of housing inequality and immobility in Boston. And maybe, just maybe, we can change people's lives. Now look around Boston again. What do you really see?